Hello there, and welcome to another tutorial about making a 3D stylized character in Blender. In this video, we're going to be looking at how to unwrap your UVs, paint your textures, and map your facial textures, along with some other little bonuses at the end. This is the final part to my 3-parter series of tutorials, so welcome back if you watched the last 2, and if you haven't, feel free to catch up on the modeling and rigging parts via the links in the description. As usual, I want to preface this by saying that this video isn't intended for absolute beginners, and if you want to learn Blender seriously, you will benefit greatly from checking out a playlist I made with all the helpful videos I studied while learning Blender in chronological order. I will also cite a couple of them during this video and navigate you to creators who can explain certain topics in better detail, as I'm not a professional and I'm still learning myself, and there are certain parts to my workflow that I'm just not as confident explaining yet. And also, for your information, I'm doing my textures in a third-party software, so I won't be showing how to utilize Blender's built-in texture painting tools in this video. The Blender theme I use is Theme 2000. Along with this rainbow matte cap you can access through the Viewport Shading Lighting menu. Thanks so much for all the support for the previous videos, and I hope you enjoyed this one as well. Now that we're finally done with rigging, I continue on to UV unwrapping, which is basically unwrapping the surface of a 3D model onto a 2D plane. It's a bit of a tedious process and probably my least favorite, but there's a couple of tips and tricks I learned that maybe can help you out too. I create a separate texture for body and face, and I use a facial texture to animate the expressions. Switch to the UV editing panel and create a new image. I don't touch the dimensions as they're perfect for most models of the size. Name this texture and turn the alpha all the way down. This is going to be our main body texture. You can choose different types of how your UV map looks. I usually go with color grid here, as it's the easiest for me to work with, and I will show you how these different types of UV maps can be helpful in a bit. So in viewport shading for this process, I like to use flat texture shading, as it makes the texture super clear and nicely visible. Before we start unwrapping, we want to set up our material so we can see this texture on the model. Create a new material, name it appropriately, in my case it's model_texture, and switch the base color here to an image texture. You can then select this image we just created. Select all the remaining objects with the textured object being the last, Ctrl L and link materials. This will quickly make all the objects the same material we just made. It looks super awkward right now because we haven't actually unwrapped or put any seams onto anything yet. Now let's go to edit mode, and before we start, let's activate live unwrap, which you can find in this transform menu under tool UVs. This will make it so every single time we make an edit to our UVs, it would automatically show on this left screen here. Now we can finally begin to apply some seams. Press the / on your keyboard, this will solid the object, and start applying the seams. There's some basic rules of thumb on how and where to apply seams, but this genuinely just comes with practice. If you want to get better at unwrapping, practice on some basic shapes first, like a cylinder, a cube, and etc. Since all of our model is made from these simple shapes, it can help us understand how to unwrap these more complex, modified versions of cubes and cylinders. First tip here is, if you want to make it a bit more visible, you can go all the way over here to guides and turn on UV stretch. Not only it shows you where your UV islands are stretching a bit too much, it also makes it easier to see. Now that we unwrap the head, you can see that the color grid is looking way nicer projected onto the model. Since we have a mirror modifier enabled, we're currently only getting one side of the model when unwrapping it. This is because it's fully symmetrical, so Blender will automatically flip the texture onto the other side. Very useful. So the face I don't really need right now, as I'm going to be working with the face separately on an individual texture, so I set it aside and press P to pin it, or lock it into that position. Now, no matter what edits I do with the rest of the map, what I pinned won't budge, which is super useful. Now, another thing with the stretching enabled, it can actually help you see where the texture will stretch too much. If you look on the horns on this side, the color grid is a bit wobbly and warps in a weird way, which means that when we apply the texture to this grid, it will also be a bit wobbly and warp in a weird way in this spot. So I decided to change the seams on the horns to see if I can make it a bit better. This here makes sense as the curve on the front of the horn is way more intense than the curve on the back of the horn, so the texture will have to be wrapped tighter around of it. You can see it better as there's more dark blue and less green on the UV island as well. Dark blue is no stretch, and closer it is to yellow, the more stretch there's gonna be. By applying seams in those areas of high stretch, we can optimize our texture and make it project better. Next tip of mine is to get this free add-on called UV Squares. It helps you straighten a UV island or a part of it. Sometimes, if you want to make an island a bit more compact, like this head for example, it's super useful, because otherwise it's an awkward shape that is taking too much space. So, I use this seam and press to grid by shape, which will snap it straight to the invisible X and Y grid. Now, we want this to stay straight, while the rest of the head adjusts to it. For this, simply press P with only this straight seam selected to lock it into place, and then select everything else and press U to unwrap it again. The rest of the island adjusted to it and now looks a lot more clean and more compact, which helps a lot because sometimes you get dozens and dozens of islands on one map and it can get pretty cramped and confusing. Once I finish unwrapping a part of the model, I pin it and set it aside. The hair I always unwrap in the same way. I select the middle seam that goes all around with Alt left click and just mark that. While unwrapping the hood here, I realized that the topology is a bit weird on the underside, so I went back and edited it a bit. For complex objects like these, it's good to separate it in parts with seams, like I did here with the head cap and the long part itself. Tip number 3, when you have two similar or completely identical islands, you might want to use this copy UV and paste UV option. It basically applies the chosen UV projection onto the other island, which is helpful to save space on the map. It will create some stretch if your islands are not completely identical, but in my case here it's not going to be a lot of a problem because there's not a lot of visible contrast on the texture, with the hood being entirely black. And I don't mind that as it's not going to be too obvious. I do try to be as clean as possible at unwrapping, but I'm definitely not as professional as a game artist would be, for example. If you're looking to work for the games industry, I really recommend studying workflows like unwrapping for a long period of time and look at some proper resources. Sometimes the copy and paste UV option is not going to work at all if Blender decides the geometry of the islands is too different, even if they look similar. Happens quite a lot, to be honest. The best way to learn unwrapping is by seriously, continuously practicing it. I want to note that this is what took me the longest to wrap my head around, so don't get discouraged. Experiment with different ways to unwrap your models and keep watching tutorials. You're basically learning a way to imagine 3D objects on a 2D plane. You're shifting dimensions here, so of course it's going to be complicated, but it's very rewarding when it finally clicks. Unwrapping the hands, I think, is the most tedious part of the whole process for me. I also came up with somewhat of a better way to unwrap it for myself, but it's very manual and also I'm unsure how professional this really is. If you have tips on how to unwrap the hands, please do share as I'm still figuring this out myself. First, I mark the seam that separates the top of the hand from the palm. And we get these two disgusting looking islands. So this is what I like to do recently. Make sure it's not pinned. Switch to the top view by pressing 7 on your number pad and select the top faces here that are visible. Press U and choose Project from View. This will unwrap the chosen faces in the exact way the camera sees it in the viewport. Then, without pressing anything, select those unwrapped faces and press P to pin. Then, select everything else and just hit U to unwrap. The rest of the hand will adjust to the pin selection and create this monstrosity. Next thing to do is to manually make it look like the hand is spreading the fingers. and adjusting everything to make sense. It does take a bit of concentration and a basic understanding of which vertex is which, but I hope what I'm doing is making a little bit of a sense here. This basically allows me to have a more proportionally accurate map to paint the texture onto, and spreading the fingers manually gives me space to paint comfortably. We want to alleviate the stretch here as well, as this applies to any UV island. The closer the color to yellow, the more stretch there is. In some areas, stretch is unavoidable, but we want to make sure that there's as little as possible here. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the palm of the hand. Clothes are usually the simplest part for me, as with low poly models you usually can, and should, use the texturing process to bring all the details to life. You don't have to model them out as you maybe would on a high poly model. With dresses, I like to separate the skirt and sleeves from the torso part, as it allows more space on the UV map. Now that we're done with the unwrapping of all of our parts of the model here, we can neatly compile all the islands on this one map. Usually, I like to be relatively neat and keep all the islands in the limits of the grid of the UV map. You can see this grid that I'm talking about better on this type of map than the others. Each letter here represents 128 by 128 square on the grid. Basically, I like to keep my islands neat in the limits of those squares. Another tip for a healthy, clean UV map is to separate it into 4 parts. In this case, 4 512 by 512 squares. I use them to organize the texture. Usually it's something like skin or body, hair, clothes, shoes. Also, most drawing programs allow you to apply a snapping feature to your grid, which makes it easier to fill out the colors on the texture. But we'll look at this in a bit. Although this is a very clean way to do this, it's not really a rule and you don't have to follow it. Sometimes I will also cut corners in some places to save time, if it's a personal project specifically. You also will want to keep all islands as proportionate to their 3D scale as possible. What I mean by this is that some objects, being way smaller in scale, like these ribbons compared to the skirt, will have to be smaller on the UV map as well. This way, all parts of the model will be textured in the same resolution. Otherwise, you'll have some parts of your texture appear way too detailed and high-res compared to others. A good way to check this is to switch to UV grid from color grid. This is what it's super helpful for. If all squares on the model appear the same size, you're good to go. If some appear way too big, the texture will appear scaled and blurred. And if they're too small, the texture will appear way too high-res compared to the rest of the model. If you're using pixel art for this texture specifically, the pixels will appear completely different sizes. So, super important step before you proceed. Now that we've finished with unwrapping, switch the type to blank. In UV menu, choose Export UV Layout. If you don't switch it to blank and then go onto the Texture Paint panel, the color grid will be automatically embedded onto the texture. Texturing the model is probably the most fun part of the process, at least it is for me, as it's really the time when the model starts coming to life. I do my textures in Photoshop, but it really doesn't matter what program you use for this. If you're into pixel art, for example, I recommend something like Sprite, and if you're doing very basic fill color textures, you're probably fine with even just sticking to Blender's built-in texture painting, but I do find it a little bit tedious and restricting to use, to be honest. Now, I think most, if not every software like this will allow you to set a grid for your canvas. In Photoshop, for example, you just have to go to your preferences and set up a grid line for every 128 pixels with just one subdivision. Now, I start by going back to my turnaround with an eyedrop tool because we're starting the texture with just filling out the base flat colors. To make it easier, go to View menu and allow snapping to the grid. Just don't forget to disable this when you're using your brush, because then the brush will also snap and create these weird squiggly lines. As you can see, I always organize my layers. It will make it so much easier in the long run, especially if you have a lot of details here. Making a folder for each body group, like skin, hair, clothes, etc. is very helpful here. Granted, for this model I'm only using like 3 colors, so this base texture will look pretty boring at the moment. After laying out the basic colors, export this as PNG and go back to Blender. Now we're switching to texture paint, and I go to this image menu here and choose replace. Then choose your exported texture file, and you can see that everything looks pretty correct so far. You can ignore the face, I'm dealing with that separately from the body texture. If your model looks duller than your texture colors, it's probably because you have your color mode set at AGX, which is the default color mode that Blender sets for you. For these kind of models, where we need the colors as exact as possible, go to Scene Properties, Color Management, and choose Standard here. Now the next part is to start painting the texture itself. Knowing which island represents what, where to apply shadow and light, really comes with practice. At first, it's difficult to understand what is what on this map. I really recommend jumping between your drawing program and Blender constantly to check if what you're painting is correct. Here I have applied some basic strokes of shadow and light, and before blending anything in, I'm going back to Blender. Now go to Image, and this time just press Reload. This will refresh your texture. Granted that the file wasn't renamed, and it is in the same location. I'm checking if everything looks okay, like if I got the proportions on the hand correct, whether this seems a bit too obvious, or if I should work a bit more on blending them, and stuff like that. This allows you to have a better understanding of your process and highlights the areas that need a bit more work. If you find yourself completely lost and don't understand what's this one island supposed to be, you can always go back to the UV editing panel. In the toolbar here, press Sync UV Editing and press on the island that you're having trouble with. You will see that it's now highlighted on the model. You can select faces, edges, and vertices this way, and they will all be highlighted, showing you exactly what you're working on. When it comes to painting itself, I don't really have a lot of rules to talk about, to be honest. This just really depends on how you draw and how you like to paint. There is a couple of things that I can mention though. First thing is that personally, I don't have a lot of contrast in my textures, lights, and shadows, because that's just how my art style is as a whole, but I do notice that sometimes having a more contrasted texture makes it easier for the details of the design to stand out from further away. I also like to use the smudge tool a lot when I texture, which is funny because I actually never ever use it for my normal 2D art workflow. I just found that on this kind of dimension texture, it really comes off very nicely for my personal taste. Yet again, a texture is doing a lot of heavy lifting on a low poly model, when you don't have the resources or the free real estate, I guess, to represent the intricate details of your design on the mesh itself. So do be smart about what gets the most amount of detail on a texture, especially if it's low res. I really recommend searching for low poly textures of like personal projects and stuff like that artists post on sites like ArtStation, and you can also find some on Pinterest as well. You can always look at how they align their UV islands and try to make sense of why they made these decisions and why they unwrapped and painted these islands the way they did. Basically, do some research. Another thing you can do is, my favorite thing to do, honestly, is to check out the models resource and the texture resource. These are websites with so many ripped video game assets from like retro games to choose from. It's genuinely invaluable. Especially if you come across a model from a game that you played yourself, seeing how it works in reality, like in the engine, is fantastic, and it's a great way to learn how to texture. Sometimes you find genuinely impressive and creative ways developers texture the character models. Personally, I find this extremely inspiring, especially when they use very limiting dimensions for the textures. I definitely like to embellish the folds of fabric a lot in my textures and add a lot of like manual shine. Most of my textures are on the highest roughness setting. If you don't know what that means, it basically means that it's the opposite of a glossy material and it doesn't reflect light in any way. Because of this, I want to manually add gloss and shine whenever I need it. Sometimes some parts of the texture are a bit more complicated, and the seams just don't align as much as I'd like them to. When painting on a model in Blender or in programs like Substance Painter, this really isn't a problem because you see exactly what you're doing straight away. But when you're importing a texture like this through a different drawing program, you can come across this problem. What I do to make it a little bit better is go back to UV editing panel and just selecting vertices and edges one by one and move them or scale them a little bit in a way that will make the seam symmetrize a bit better. Kind of like post-production on the texturing or UV unwrapping, I guess. Now, next part to do here is the face texture. For the face, I'm making a separate texture, same process as before. In the UV editing panel, create a new image and set the alpha to 0. Now, first thing I'm going to do is simply apply the mirror modifier on the head. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, our face is going to be mostly symmetrical, but some facial expressions I will want to be not symmetrical. And the other reason is that personally, it's just easier for me to draw the face this way, where I can see exactly how it's going to be looking in full on my canvas straight away. Now, if we select the entirety of the head with Ctrl A, the island that we already unwrapped is going to be highlighted again. But because we pinned it all the way before, these islands stay in place and are still perfectly mirrored on the model. All we want to unwrap now is, well, the faces on the face. I'm making a new material here just for the face. And as base color, I choose the new image we created. Now, I like to separate the eye and mouth materials to animate them one by one. So I add the same material here and press this button here to duplicate it, creating a new copy. Rename it to mouth and choose all the faces where only the mouth is going to be drawn and assign the mouth material to those faces. To check if you've done it correctly, if you select just the mouth material, it will highlight the right faces, and vice versa with the eyes. These two materials are going to be using the same image here. It's just that we're telling Blender that different groups of UV islands are going to be controlled by two different materials, if that makes sense. Now I select both of these and I'm making sure that I'm in front view by pressing 1 on my numpad and then press U to unwrap and select project from view. This will unwrap the faces in the exact way you see them on the screen here, which makes it super useful for drawing on facial expressions. Now we're going to be using very specific coordinates here for this UV island to ensure that the texture mapping down the line works properly. All you need to know basically is that I keep the face in those 4 squares here on the grid, and I make sure that the X coordinate here is exactly 0.125. The Y coordinate really doesn't matter that much at the moment. Change the type to blank, export this map, and back to our drawing software of choice. I enable snap and create a reference sheet of sorts by copying and pasting this UV of the face into all the squares of my grid, creating space for basically exactly 16 facial expressions. Now all that's left here is to draw on the face. I usually trace my own design of the face onto this texture to make sure it's as close as possible to the original concept. So I cut a part of my design and paste it here on low opacity. In all programs like this, I think you can enable symmetry. In Photoshop, you do this by pressing this little butterfly while having your brush selected and enabling vertical or horizontal symmetry. I like to separate all of the features into their own layers, so editing them is a bit easier. So we got mouth, lashes, eyeball, eye pupil, eyebrows. After those line art-like features, I also make a layer each for skin, shadows, blush, and details. The rest here is entirely up to you yet again. I also forgot in this moment that I'm doing these cross pupils separately, so I just got rid of them for now. After this, I want to check out how it looks on the model, so the same thing here again. Back in Blender, replace the image with your new exported texture. I'm just making the cheeks on the mesh less pronounced, so the texture doesn't warp in such a strange way here. And next thing I'm going to do here is quickly make the pupils. So it's entirely a stylistic choice of mine. I came up with this when I was making my first model, and I really like the way it allows me to manipulate and animate them separately from the face. So I'm bringing in a plane and mirroring it, making it into a cross by applying a couple loop cuts and beveling them, deleting the unnecessary faces, and here we have a cross. Now to make it 3D, I apply a solidify on it, as usual, smoothing the corners here a bit with Ctrl B again. I don't need these textures, so I just put a pure black emission shader on them. Now we have to go back to armature edit mode, as we need to add a bone to each cross. Make one of the bones point from the cross and outwards, name it accordingly, and symmetrize it. And then parent it to the head bone. Now I do the same process as before, but just on the eye object this time. Parent them to the armature with empty groups, and in wet paint, just apply the maximum weight from the left bone to the left eye, and it's going to be automatically symmetrized. Testing this out in pose mode, and it looks great. Just adding these eyes to a separate bone collection. As I said before, I'm fixing the roughness of my material here by bringing this all the way up so it's less reflective. So now I'm gonna work on a couple of faces here just to show off how the texture mapping really works. Drawing on some simple gestures here for both eyes and mouth, like eyes looking in different directions and basic vowels. The last thing I'm setting up here is the face texture mapping. This technique allows me to change the texture of the eyes and mouth and animate it. Now, this is super important. I learned this entirely by following this video by Lacruza, so please watch it if you're interested in properly learning how it works. To be completely honest, the shader setup for this is a bit too complicated for me to be able to explain confidently, and I'd really rather you learn from someone who can explain this properly. But in a nutshell, I need another 2 bones, non-deforming this time, just to control the eyes and the mouth. And what these bones control exactly is the location of the UV islands on the X and Y axis. So every time you move the eye bone, the island that's assigned to the eye material moves by 0.125 pixels, either down on the Y axis or right on the X axis. And the same way with the mouth material. This is why the exact X coordinate was important during the unwrapping of the face. This is the node setup for both eye and mouth material respectively. Pretty intense. Definitely watch that video if you want to know exactly what's happening here, as I don't know enough about blend and math myself, but basically each of those represent one of the 16 squares on the facial grid. This node setup is then in turn being controlled by a new driver that's linked to these bones, 1 driver per bone. This is it in a very simplified way, so yeah, please go give Lacruza the views because they explain it super well and they really deserve it. Now, all that's left to do here for this model is really to finish the full face texture. I didn't go for complicated expressions here, and I just kind of made them up as I went along, but yet again, I do recommend doing a bit of prep work before this and finding a couple of references if you feel like you need it. Now, this is the very last thing I do for my models after I completed all the textures, is dithering. So dithering is a process of pixelation of color that happens after transferring it into a very limited color palette and bit depth. This creates a bit of random noise on a lot of the gradients that are present on your original texture and gives them that crunchy pixel look. I use a free tool called SLK Imp. Oh god, I cannot pronounce this, but I'll leave a link for it in the description, and here it is on the screen. I definitely recommend playing around with this yourself, as it's super fun to experiment. For example, you can play around with absolute or relative sampling, which will determine the dimension and resolution of your end product. Play with the color count on the palette. The lesser the colors, the sharper your pixelation will be. Dithering style is the part that determines how the gradients on your picture will be treated, how intense they are or how soft, how much they bleed over, etc. And then you can also save the settings that you're happy with as a preset and then use it on your face, texture next, so you don't have to do the same thing all over again for two different pictures. I absolutely love how the textures look personally, but I do have to say they can look pretty awkward if you're planning your model to have like super glossy materials. This definitely works better with non-reflective, rough materials. To make these textures pop even more, I always choose closest interpolation instead of linear, as all these pixels are just way more pronounced and clear this way. And here we are, this model is basically all done and dusted. And here's how the character looks like in action. I had a huge blast making her, and I'm very glad that I was able to share this process with you guys. So thank you so very much for watching these videos, and I'm glad that they were somewhat helpful. Making these series of tutorials kind of completely overtook my entire free time over the past like 2 months, I think. But I felt like I really needed to get it out and put some good effort into making these videos the best I can. I had a lot of fun, and I will definitely make more videos soon, so stay tuned. Maybe I'll even stream. Shocking, I know. Although I think I'll lay off the tutorials for a while, as I don't want to completely burn out doing the same thing over and over. But let me know if there's anything else you'd want to see on this channel in the future. Anyway, I appreciate everyone who interacted with me over these videos and subscribed, because it's very nice and kind of you all to do so. So thank you. Feel free to check out my socials if you want to see more of my art. Here's where I'm active the most. And I'll see you soon. Bye!